Welcome to Bible Study Hub. I'm Noelle, my mother Ann with us. Mom, we've been going through some crazy dreams over
Yeah.
the past couple of weeks in the book of Daniel. I feel like it was just one wild dream after another. This week we get to talk about, we're going to discuss the fulfillment of one of those dreams and then talk about another crazy prophecy that was fulfilled. But can you just jog our memory on the most recent incredible, absurd, ridiculous dream that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had? I feel like we need to get ourselves
Yeah.
situated.
Yeah. Well, definitely. So we're in Daniel chapter 4, and we just couldn't quite finish it off last time we wanted to, and we just ran out of time. So we kind of ended with King Nebuchadnezzar sharing his dream with the prophet Daniel. And the dream was that there was this big tree, and it grew huge, and it filled the whole earth, and all the beasts of the field and the birds of the air took shelter under it, and it was going really well. And then all of a sudden, that tree got chopped down, and there was just a stump left, but it had bands of iron and bronze around the stump. And then all of a sudden the pronouns change from like it describing the tree to like he and him, and it says let his body be covered with the dew of heaven and let him eat grass like an ox and things like that. So you can imagine at this point Nebuchadnezzar is thinking, this started well and then it got bad. I don't know what's going on, but something went wrong. And so he calls in Daniel, and Daniel is going to interpret the dream. And basically the synopsis that Daniel gives him, and we ended with this last time, is that King Nebuchadnezzar, you're the tree. God is going to chop you down, but he's not going to kill you. For 7 years, you are going to have the brain of an ox. And yeah, you're going to live out in the field and eat grass and stuff like that. And then at the end of the 7 years, you're going to acknowledge the one true God, which parenthetically, Nebuchadnezzar has had opportunities to do this in the past with incredible things going on. He has not done it, but Daniel's like, this is third time's the charm. You're going to do it this time. And so he says to Nebuchadnezzar at the end of this, repent. Maybe if you repent, God will have mercy on you and your prosperity will continue. And basically the stuff, maybe God will relent and not bring this judgment on you. So where we're going to pick up tonight in Daniel chapter 4, verses 28 to 30, we're going to find out, Noelle, did Nebuchadnezzar heed the advice of Daniel to repent? Does he do it?
Who thinks that he did it? All right, I know the suspense is killing you. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. You're like, oh, surprise, surprise. This guy, at the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? The guy is just shameless. Like, he has no sense whatsoever. And I love what happens next. It says, while the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. Not one of the more dignified situations for a king. But one of the things that's just amazing, I mean, we start in verse 28 where it says at the end of 12 months. So this is 12 months after Daniel has just interpreted this dream and told him really explicitly, this is what this means, this is what's going to happen. At the end of 12 months, this happens. Mom, I don't know about for you, but that kind of, I don't know, that raises the question for me, like, why did God not deal with this immediately? Like, to have a whole year pass between the dream and then the actual fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, it actually almost feels unfair. It's like,
Grace is
Hey.
always unfair, right? That's what makes it grace. But yeah, let's answer this in our chat. So Facebook and YouTube, if you're watching live right now, start typing. What do you think brought this on now? As Noel said, we've gotten the prophecy. God always does what he says he will do. You can take it to the bank, 100%. And God gives Nebuchadnezzar an entire year. While you're typing, I'll just kind of go through what like went through in my mind. Like I imagine like the next day Nebuchadnezzar woke up and he's like, nothing. I'm still here, I'm still in my right mind. I'm not eating grass. Okay. And then maybe a week went by, maybe a month went by, and he's like, that's weird. You know, he said this would happen if I didn't repent, and I haven't repented. And or maybe I tried to turn over a new leaf, but you know, I still like my other gods too. And then 2 months, and then 5 months, and then 7 months, and then 8 months, 10 months, 11 months go by, and nothing has happened. And at this point, I don't think he even remembers anymore. He probably has totally discounted this.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and start reading, because we've got some really good comments.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, God often gives us pause to figure it out and get it right. And these pauses, I love this. These pauses are always where I have learned the most. And I agree with that. I mean, God, we see this also in the story of Jonah, where God like gives an opportunity to repent and is like, I'm going to tell you so you have time. It's so good. I like this one, to bring him down from his very high view of himself and humble himself, almost as though those words that he says in that moment is not this great Babylon, which I've built by my mighty powers, a royal residence for the glory of my majesty. In some ways that kind of like triggers this, like, okay, like you truly are beyond even getting the point. God wanted to give him time to repent. Absolutely. This is good. If he didn't change a year later, he probably wouldn't have. And God's like, all right, well, your time is up. Like that makes a lot of sense. Margie says God gave him time to repent. Kathy says something interesting. She says, a day is as 1,000 years to God. And maybe some of you read that and you're like, I don't know what that means. Like, what is that? She's actually quoting something, right, Mom?
Well, yeah. One thing that we know that God is outside of the paradigm of time that he created for us to live in. So when he says a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day, obviously that's a literary device to say that time does not apply to God. So what feels,
but that's something that God actually said. So that's something that's written in our Bible.
Exactly.
God said about himself and how he lives. How he exists within time very differently than
within and outside of time. So what feels like very, very long to us is not long to God, and what feels short to us is not short to God. He's just outside of that. So yeah, he can choose to give us a year or a minute or nothing. Whatever he wants to do. So that's good. There's a few more really good comments here. Like, it's like when we like when we count to our kids 1, 2, 3 before we act. That's an interesting way to put it. He's not counting, but he's definitely saying, I'm giving you time to do the right thing. Somebody else says it's pride. And I think it's one word and super, super insightful, because that's exactly at the root of what Nebuchadnezzar is going through here. And someone else to camp on that says, so full of himself. He's so full of himself, and he's hard-hearted. You guys are amazing.
Hard-headed.
Oh, hard-headed. Oh, yeah.
Both. There's both. There's hard-headed. There's hard-hearted. No, I love all of that. You are all you're excellent. So correct. You're so on point with that. Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways, this should be actually kind of an encouraging passage in a weird way, because it's like there's some people come into a relationship with God with this paradigm that he is there waiting to just like crush you, and like lightning will strike, and like he just wants to just punish. And that is one view of how people look at God. And what this shows us is that God at times extends just huge grace and mercy for us to follow and to get it right. And he gave Nebuchadnezzar the time and the space to decide if he was going to repent and if he was going to follow. And then once it became clear that was not going to happen, it's like, all right, well, then we have to move on to the next option, because I love you and because I want to bring you to myself. But it's not I think what's encouraging me is that just straight up punishing him was not God's first choice here. Sometimes it is. Sometimes God is like, hey, we're done. You know enough. Margie even compares it to Pharaoh, who
That's excellent.
God gave a lot of chances to before being like, all right, we're done. And
He
it's
is-
really powerful.
He's a merciful God. Well, let's go
Yeah.
on to verses 34 and 35, because remember, we said last
Yeah.
time, I almost said last week, but actually we took off last week. So last time that Nebuchadnezzar is like writing his autobiography in this
Right.
chapter 4. So he's still writing. So verses 34 to 35 said, and he's speaking for himself here, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven and my reason returned to me. And then he doesn't say, and I cursed the Most High because I was so mad that I lived as an ox. He doesn't say that. He says, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. And then he just bursts into like poetry and song here. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? This guy is converted. I mean, all it takes is 7 years as a cow, and but he didn't have to come out that side. He could have come out cursing God, saying, how dare you turn me into a cow for 7 years?
Yeah.
He doesn't do that. He praises the name of God. No, well, when we were in the book of Luke, there was another instance where God really, really went to like great lengths.
Right. Well, it was actually, the author was Dr. Luke. If we're thinking of the same one, this was actually in the book of
You're right.
Acts, where
You're right. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, the story of Paul's conversion, so Saul becomes Paul. Some of you might know him as Saint Paul or the Apostle Paul. I mean, the way that God got his attention was by conquering him. And it was really interesting because God chose to use a tactic or a strategy with Paul, blinding him, that was just ubiquitous in that day for kings conquering other kings. They would blind them. And Paul came from a tribe that were warriors. And you even get this in just reading him, he was a warrior. And that was who he was. And God chose to conquer him in that way, and be like, hey, I'm going to use imagery that you understand, that I have conquered you. And yet even in that, there's this incredible grace, because even with Paul, we see that after a relatively short period of time, not as long as this guy, pretty short, he gets his sight back, and he actually has a relationship with Christ at that point. It's interesting that God chose a method to get his attention. Obviously blindness would, but it intrinsically had more meaning than just like, oh, I can't see anymore. It would have been very clear to him what the message was. It strikes me that there's sort of something like that happening here. While this is definitely like, God is in charge, God is taking over, I feel like more so the message that God is giving here is one of hierarchy and one of position and authority, even more so than like king conquering another nation that he did with Saul. Because certainly Nebuchadnezzar would have understood that, an ox, a cow, is so low compared to a human, like so meaningless and, so unsophisticated and so powerless, really. And I think that's very much what God was communicating to Nebuchadnezzar when he chose this particular extravagant, really almost eccentric way of like getting his attention, of going, this is actually where you are in relation to me. I'm going to give you an image that you could understand, because you clearly don't have a concept of your position in this hierarchy. You seem to think you're at the top. You seem to think you built it. You seem to think you're really a great dude, real powerful. No, I'm going to show you exactly how you fall in submission and relative like priority order to me. Do you agree with that assessment of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the big issue has always been that Nebuchadnezzar has always put his own gods either on the same level with or above the one true God. And God does not share his glory with another. So it's almost as if God says, so since we can't seem to get that straightened around and now you're glorifying yourself, I will put you in your place for 7 years. That's a long time. That's a long time to live as a cow. Well, let's go on to verses 36 and 37. Noelle, you want to read those?
Yeah, at the same time, still King Nebuchadnezzar. At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just. This is key. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble.
Yes. You know, we had talked before about the bands of iron and bronze around the tree stump in his dream, where God had chopped him down, said, I'm not going to kill you. And then there's those bands. And a lot of commentators are like, we just don't know what those bands are. And so I guess they're right, because the Bible doesn't explicitly say what the bands are. But I think as you read this text, something that comes to the surface, at least for me, is that this whole situation is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, on so many levels, but especially one that we may not readily think of, and that is this. The leader of this country, the king himself, is out there on the lawn like a cow for 7 years. He's eating grass. His hair has grown out, so it looks like bird feathers. He's got claws now for nails, and he's acting like a beast. In that time, in those 7 years, nobody ousted this guy. I mean, think about this for a minute. Your leader is out there eating grass and looking like a beast. You think the other countries around don't say to themselves, it seems like a good time to attack. I mean, I'm just going to say, if you're going to go in and get something done, now's the time to do it, because King's out there on the lawn eating dandelions. It seems like that would be a good time to have. Then you have coups all the time. There's coups all over history. There's always people knocking off the king and putting their son in, or putting
in the best situation, there's a power struggle.
Yes. And there's not. Nobody takes his place. They just all sit and wait for him to come back inside. So you look at that and you go, there is 100% ridiculously evident divine protection covering over King Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom. There is no explanation outside of that for how this guy goes through this, comes out the other side, and is reinstated immediately to his throne, and then is given all this honor, and people come to him for advice. There's no other explanation. So I personally think those bands of iron and bronze, which were the two strongest metals that they had at the time, is God saying, I'm going to cut you down, but I'm going to hold you together. I'm going to hold the kingdom together for you. I'll tell you, if God is holding the kingdom together, nobody is taking it apart. And if God takes it apart, you cannot hold it together. And God is just that sovereign. And that should give us peace.
There tonight too, right?
Yeah, peace and comfort, no matter what the situation is going on, wherever you live. God's in control.
I want to just quickly camp out on that last part of the verse for a moment too, because I mean, who can better sum up the point of this all? Those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. And King Nebuchadnezzar so clearly identifies what the issue was. And you all identified it earlier too. I mean, it's almost heavy-handed with how prideful this guy was and how big of an issue it is. But it does occur to me that we live in a culture that actually elevates pride not as a sin, but as something to strive for and something excellent and something that we should all have. And you know, there's some element of that that's just a linguistic thing, like take pride in your work, and it's like that's not a sin. But I can't. I was having this thought because I live in Seattle, and I was walking to work the other day, and I was like, I'm going to count all the signs that I see. It's a 5-block walk. I'm going to count all the signs that I see that in some way extol pride as a virtue. And there were 16 in my 5 blocks that were just with the word pride very specifically as this virtuous, excellent thing that we should strive for, that should be protected. And it struck me as very interesting because, even as I say this, probably some of you are like, that's just a linguistic thing too. Like, don't get too hung up on it. That's not what they're saying. And I understand that. But our language does significantly influence the way we behave and the things we value and how we think, how we approach the world, how we experience life and behaviors that we value. And I think it justifies things that are not justified. And so when I read this passage, it stands in such stark contrast to the culture that I walk in all day, every day. And it feels almost more severe now than when I read these passages, years ago, where it was like, well, yeah, I mean, hubris, pride is a bad thing. And now I'm like, whoa, have I sort of internalized this in some way as well, that, pride is some virtue? King Nebuchadnezzar was under no illusion that it was. I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that, Mom.
No, I just agree with you. We're all a product of our culture. We try really hard to have a biblical worldview and not to have that infiltrated by the things that we live in. And yet it still infiltrates. It does. And what we're not saying is that you need to loathe yourself, hate yourself, think that you're horrible at everything. That's not healthy either. But I think there's a difference between, you know what we're talking about, like that sense of pride, like, yeah, it's kind of, I'm good at that. I did that. I accomplished that. I. And there's something else to say, God, thank you for gifting me in this way so that I can serve you. And there's a huge difference there. And so we're just saying, just be mindful. Just be mindful. We don't want to end up like King Nebuchadnezzar. We really don't want to be out there eating.
Well, on that note, let's move.
Just the amount of bugs you would ingest alone just like freaks me out. I mean, just
that's the problem. Think about your nails. Oh, actually, that's not true. Long nails right now, talon-like claws, very chic. Nebuchadnezzar, everyone would have been like, get that guy in vogue. Gorgeous. Where did you get those little talons?
Sure. Everyone would have been after he's done. Well, let's move on to Daniel chapter 5 on that note.
I feel like we need to before we go into Daniel chapter 5, there's history leading up to this.
Yeah.
And it's important to note for those of us just reading it straight through, Western mind, we're like linear, everything like straight. That's like not how yeah, right. That's not how this is written. That's not how anything would have been written in this time. So we do have to understand it in its cultural context, is that in some ways this is almost more thematic than it is linear. And that's not even totally true, but it helps me understand it a little bit. So we're actually jumping way ahead in history in chapter 5. Daniel's still alive, but can you just walk us through, Mom? I think it's important, and maybe if you're kind of a history buff like me, you'll find this interesting. There's a couple of regime changes that happen before we get to where we're going to start in Daniel 5.
Yeah, this is actually really fascinating. So let me just I'm referencing my notes if you see me looking off to the side. So Nebuchadnezzar reigns for 43 years, and Daniel serves him all the way through. We know that because Daniel is still on the scene here. So if Daniel was taken as a hostage way back when he was about 15 years old, which is what we think he was when they brought him in that first deportation from Judah to Babylon. If that's the case, then he's in his 80s, early 80s at this time. So I just think, we have to okay, so we went from young man to now we have an older man. So anyway, Nebuchadnezzar's son, whose name was Evil-Merodach, and I know evil, just like they actually named him evil. Okay, it's just
I know everything I need to know about this man.
Probably did apply. However, it's just a really unfortunate transliteration from the original language. It just happened to be evil, which happens to be like wicked in English, but that's not what they That's not how he was named. But anyway, so we read about him in 2 Kings 25 and Jeremiah 52, if you're interested. He only rules for 2 years, and then he gets assassinated by his brother-in-law, whose name is Neriglissar. So Neriglissar, who we read about in Jeremiah 39, ruled for 4 years only, and then he just dies because he just dies. He gets old or something. Natural death. So his son, oh man, Labaroth-Sharad.
Okay, I'm gonna just put it on the screen, and we're gonna just
You
not say
figure it
again.
out. I have no idea how that's a lot of syllables from a small brain. All right. He is an only child, and historians refer to him, there it is, as one of diminished mental capacity. So I don't know exactly what that meant, but he was a kid, and apparently he had some sort of something going on. So he only rules for 9 months, and then he's savagely beaten to death by a gang of conspirators. I mean, they beat this poor child to death. This is how bad these people are. So the conspirators then appoint a man named Nabonidus, one of their gang, to be the king. So he actually rules from that time all the way up until the Medes and the Persians under King Cyrus conquer Babylon. Remember the statue? We have the head of gold. That was Nebuchadnezzar, and then God said, then we have the chest of what was that? Silver. Chest of silver, that's the Medes and the Persians. That's who conquers this Nabonidus guy. And it's over for Babylon. So if you're astute right now, you've got your antenna up and you say, wait a minute. I've read Daniel chapter 5. There's a king in there named King Belshazzar, not Belteshazzar. That was the Persian name for Daniel. This is just Belshazzar. No t in there. Similar meaning, but different name. King Belshazzar. Okay. So King Belshazzar was mentioned absolutely nowhere else in history. Noelle, take it from here because this is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, he's not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. He's not mentioned anywhere else in history. Again, we know that it was King Nabonidus who was the last king of Babylon. And so for Daniel to come in and start talking about this King Belshazzar, it's like, your facts are wrong. So we say the Bible has to be inerrant, needs to be correct. And for basically the last 2,000 years, give or take, the thought process was from the Christians, there is something that we don't know. We're going to trust that the Bible is true. We're going to roll with this. And then all the secular scholars were like, we have no evidence of this guy existing. Therefore, the whole book is, maybe kind of historical fiction. And the author made this guy up. But in 1854, something really intriguing happened. The Nabonidus cylinder was discovered. And you're looking at this and you're like, oh my, that's amazing. This British archaeologist named J.G. Taylor, I'm reading from my notes, this is just too many weird words coming up. He excavated a ziggurat at Ur called Elugal Galga Sissa of the Temple of Sin Complex. Just a lot of words there. But basically what is crazy about this, he found 4 identical cuneiform cylinders. You can see one of these on here in 1854. This one's 4 inches long. This actually mentions Belshazzar as the eldest son and co-regent with Nabonidus. This is so critical. So now we know, because of these cuneiform cylinders, that Belshazzar became the co-regent in the 3rd year of Nabonidus' reign. So this is 553 BC. He continues in that capacity until the fall of Babylon. We'll get there in a minute, in 539 BC. And this is actually on display in a British history museum of some sort. So this is really important. Nabonidus, as we know from history, is technically king, but Belshazzar is his second in command. His son is leading the day-to-day logistics operations. It's CEO and COO. And this is so important. We can say hey, it took us a while to find it until 1854, but we do have historical extra biblical record of Belshazzar being a king, co-regent during this time. It just lends huge authenticity to the word. I love these things. We don't rely on archaeology solely for understanding the Bible. And I think one of the reasons that biblical archaeologists are often in most cases, they are not believers, is because they're looking at the Bible exclusively through their realm of archaeology. And so when we look at archaeology as believers, we look at it with the whole picture. It's like I heard a biblical archaeologist talk about how it's like a jigsaw puzzle, and it's a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle. You open the box and there's 5 pieces in it. And it's like, there's just not much you can do with that. You know, you can sort of analyze each piece. You can even kind of like look at the picture on the box and be like, oh, well, I guess this, would fit here if the rest of the puzzle were here. But it's not, you can't actually create anything with it. You can't verify that any of this is right. And so that's sort of the difference between, so people who are looking at the Bible solely through the lens of biblical archaeology, they've got 5 jigsaw pieces. When we look at the Bible, we're looking at those 500 pieces, and once in a while we're missing a piece, like we were missing this piece of the jigsaw puzzle until 1854. It actually didn't impede our ability to understand the jigsaw puzzle because we had the other 490 something pieces. So we were like, yeah, this looks right. We're missing a piece here. And then it comes in, you're like, okay, I've got it. And so that sort of helps. I think it helps position the role of archaeology in our understanding of the Bible. I so appreciate your comments on this, that you find this as interesting as we do. Always love these things that are, connecting sort of external sources with the Bible. But it's also just important to position this in like, how do we use archaeology or any of these other disciplines as a tool to understand the Bible? We don't want to get so hung up on it, but it is just a powerful tool. So with all of that being said, Mom, anything to add to that? I mean, you found all the research on that cuneiform cylinder. I still don't get why it's a cylinder. Somebody go figure out why it was. I have more questions about that. Like, that doesn't make sense, but
I didn't even hit my radar that it was a cylinder.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
well, let's just go on and let's just talk for just a brief second, because we're going to get to this more in just a moment. But just what is going on this infamous night that we're about to read about in Daniel chapter 5. So secular historians from that time period, Greek and Babylonian, tell us that Nabonidus, this is Belshazzar's dad, the real king, he had gone out to fight the Medo-Persian army, and either he had been captured or he fled, but whatever the case was, they lost. Okay, so he's not there now. And so the armies are now coming to surround the actual city of Babylon, which, by the way, Nabonidus had put his son, I'll say propped his son, who's not real bright, up to be the king of this huge city. Like, if they can take the city of Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, it's over. The kingdom has fallen. The empire is destroyed. Yeah. That's the one that they need to get. So in this moment, when his dad's been conquered, Belshazzar should be probably freaking out and figuring out how to make sure that those Medes and Persians do not come in and take the city. But he's not afraid at all. We're going to read this in just a second. So not to go on and on about the history, but it's just so interesting. All right. So here's the thing. You have to understand what this walled city, and remember, in these days, they did build walls around the big cities because that was the only way to really protect them and fortify them. Yeah. So Babylon, conservatively speaking, had outer walls. So picture the outer walls around the city, 17 miles long. So 17 miles of wall. These outer walls, and I say outer because there was also an inner set of walls as well. So the out ones, 22 feet wide or thick. So thick that chariots could race each other on top of the wall if they wanted to. They were 90 feet high. They had guard towers at 100 feet high where archers could stand and, peg people that were trying to get in. They had, this is really important too, they had in between the outer wall that the chariots could race on, and then the inner wall, just another fortifying, huge amounts, expanses of farmland. So this is important. One of the things that armies would do in these ancient times was surround a city that they couldn't penetrate and then stop the food supply from going in and out. So that the people would eventually starve to death. But guess what? Babylon was totally self-supporting. And they also had around that outer wall a huge moat, really deep moat that was fed by the Euphrates River. So you had to cross a moat, then you had to get through these 22-foot walls, then you had to get across this expansive farmland, then you had to get in the inner city wall. So Belshazzar, the petty king of his city, given to him by his daddy, he's just not worried. He is not worried at all. So let's find out, Noelle, in Daniel chapter 5, how King Belshazzar is spending his time on this very important night when he's under attack.
Yes, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Just real. It's like if you gave a kingdom to a frat boy, this is how it goes down. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Where do we start on the problems here? We'll go backwards. First of all, worshiping fake gods never goes well. But we've got this issue of the vessels taken from the temple. If you're not, immediately recalling what's going on here, what this refers to, when Nebuchadnezzar went and basically laid siege to Jerusalem, he plundered the temple and brought all of their vessels for worship back. And God had given very specific instructions on what things needed to be in the temple, how they needed to be made, what they were to be used for. And these were holy vessels. I mean, they were taken very seriously. It wasn't this casual sort of, we'll just throw these, red Solo cups in there and that'll be fine. And so when that gets removed, it's a huge deal. Help me understand, Mom. Help us understand, how big of a deal is it for Belshazzar to be, he's just having a party, so
right.
It's like, hey, use some additional, fancier china.
Right, that's kind of how it appears. Well, first of all, we know from even other Bible passages that these pagan kings, when they had parties, they were bad. This is not just everybody had too much to drink. That is not at all what's going on here, although they did have too much to drink. This is, think of the book of Esther, if you're familiar with the Bible. King Xerxes has, he wants his wife Vashti to come in and dance for them. And she's like, not doing it. That's because they would have these orgies. Herod in the book of Acts or Luke. Sorry, and I don't know. I'm all confused about which one. I think it was Luke. Yeah, for John the Baptist, he's having this big party. His stepdaughter is dancing again. You know what I'm talking about, right?
It's not going well.
Bad. So we know from history and even from other biblical accounts that this party was a big sexual orgy. Okay, let's just say it. And so when he brings these things in from the temple, and they are drinking out of, they are desecrating these things on purpose, purposefully desecrating everything they can get their hands on from the God of Daniel, the God of Judah's temple. So we want you to sound off for a minute here. Why do you think that this was the moment that Belshazzar decided, let's go get this stuff from the temple? But go ahead and start chatting if you're on Facebook or YouTube live with us. It's been a long, long time, many, many decades. Remember, Daniel was about 15 when this happened. He's now in his 80s. So they've been sitting in this other temple on display for a very long time. And shame on Nebuchadnezzar for not somehow securing these things or sending them back or something, but he didn't.
Yeah.
Now his
do the right thing
sort of great grandson, although not by blood, grandson is going to use these. So really interested to know what you think about that. Why now? What's the point?
Yeah. Arissa beautifully captures, the significance. I love the phrase bigger than capturing the flag. Knowing the significance and then just showing that off in that flagrant manner. Yeah, you're spot on. This is
that's really insightful.
And I think what you're doing a really nice job of communicating, Arissa, is that he would have understood, at least to some extent, the significance of what he was doing. He wasn't, he didn't go into his room and was like, oh, those are really cute. Why don't we use those at my party? He did he did have at least some concept of the significance of these and the horror of what he was doing. I think that's a point so well taken. Yeah, I so struggle at this point. We're multiple years now removed from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who, after his whole little stint as an ox, really like came around. You read that, so Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have done that. But we're several years out from this. Even at that, though, you would imagine that this guy, in some way, I I don't necessarily see the strategic impetus to decide to do, this act right now of all times. Like, what is the point? He wanted to show he was important, and a pride thing. I'm catching a theme because he liked them. Yeah, and I think pulling out that pride piece of this is so important.
It's possible that he did hear about the first prophecy where Daniel, did the statue, and that he didn't necessarily know who it would be that would be the chest of silver that would come and take over and conquer Babylon. But we have to, because we're going to be told in a minute that Daniel actually says to him, you knew about this with your grandfather. You knew that he lived like an ox. You didn't heed that. So if he knew that, he probably also had heard about the other crazy things that had happened as well in the dreams. If he knows that the Medes and the Persians are at his doorstep, so to speak, and he knows that this God who has the temple vessels was the one who said, you're going to be conquered. He's looking at his city and he's going, it's impossible. That God can't do it. And it, honestly, and not to be crass, but if I can just say this, it's kind of like by doing this, he's giving the real true God the middle finger. This is how it feels to us. Like, I know what you said and you can't get me, and my gods are better. And so he goes and he's just desecrating what he can get his hands on, which at this point is just the vessels. And that would also explain why God does what he's about to do. And I'm going to have to hop off because I got to go to work.
So sad.
I'm so sad. I don't want to leave, but I have to. So anyway, Noelle, you can finish this thing off, and I'll see you all next week.
We will finish it off. Thank you for being with us. Yeah, so let's just wrap this thing up. All fantastic answers as to what's going on here. Let's actually read how God chooses to respond to this situation. When we go to Daniel chapter 5, verse 5, it says, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed for all of the obvious reasons. If you've ever heard the expression, handwriting or writing on the wall, handwriting on the wall, this is where that expression came from. And I want to note, verse 6, there's a phrase that says, his limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. That's really good translation of it. The interpretation, sort of literally what it means, is his hip joints alarmed him and his knees were loose. And a lot of scholars think this was likely some euphemism for he lost control of his bodily functions, which makes this is like such a I hate doing these like gross parties because everything just feels so crass and disgusting. But it's entirely possible he'd been drinking, he was drunk, and he was scared to death, and this resulted in him losing control of his bodily functions. He had trouble standing up. He became very pale, his color changed. And this is what is so, I guess irritating. We see it over and over again. He calls in the same people who King Nebuchadnezzar liked to bring in, who could do nothing and were worthless. And once again, they do nothing and they are worthless and they are perplexed and they don't know what's going on. It's like, we've got a pattern. I'm getting a little tired of reading the same thing over and over again. Before we move on to when he finally brings in the right guy for this, note that it says that he offers them to be the third ruler in the kingdom. This is in verse 7. Clothed with purple, have a chain of gold around his neck, shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Knowing what we just shared with you about, his father, Nabonidus, he's second, doesn't it make so much sense then that he is offering, he can't offer second in command, he is second in command, so he's like, you'll be third in command. There you go. And I love this because it even further just like in text supports what that archaeology has said. And I love this. Haven't we heard this story before? It's exhausting. We just keep going through it over and over again. So let's go. Finally, the guy, gets himself together. This is chapter 5, verse 10. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, he will show the interpretation. Just a note on who's speaking here. This is most likely the queen mother. The wives and the concubines, as you've heard, are already at the party having their little situation. The elderly queen probably wouldn't have had much interest in this situation. And she does remember Daniel. And like any good mother, she is there to solve her kids' problems and be like, you dork, what are you doing? Here's your option. Daniel's in his 80s now, like we talked about before, but he's still remembered for his wisdom and his abilities to interpret. And so he's summoned here, and it appears that he's summoned for the first time in a very long time, given that she gives all this background on him of who he is and what he's done. And just one other note before we move on. Daniel's still in Babylon, still doing the same thing. I can't imagine how hard it would be to live in this. And he's in his 80s now. He spent basically his entire life here living under it. And he still is following God and is still faithful and is still filled with the Spirit, even after all of that, which is just, it's amazing. One last note, when it says father, we've talked about this before, in biblical text and ancient texts, that can refer to father, grandfather, great-grandfather. It's like your forefathers. It's sort of a broad term. So Nebuchadnezzar was not his dad. Nebuchadnezzar was 2 generations removed from him. Just a note. Let's read. King gets himself together. He's like, okay, bring in Daniel. Then Daniel is brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king, my father, brought from Judah. I've heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing, make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel's like, I've been here before and know this situation. Pagan king has learned nothing from his predecessors. He just knows that he needs something. He's kind of desperate. He'll call in Daniel. I also just kind of picture, so if our understanding of what that previous passage meant in verse 6, you've got this king who is just off the wall drunk, who has soiled himself with all this just horrible party stuff going on behind him, standing there offering Daniel, you can be dressed in purple and have a gold chain and be third ruler. And Daniel just has to be like, oh, for heaven's sakes, I can't believe that I'm still doing this. These guys are so ridiculous. They're so outrageous. And in verse 17, Daniel just gives Such a nice, quick answer. Daniel answered before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself. Give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king, make known to him the interpretation." Don't don't think for a moment that Daniel is not entirely aware that this is going to go. There will be nothing to give when this is over, right? So if we go on, "O king, most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship, greatness. Because of the greatness that he gave him, all people, nations, languages trembled. He'd be kept alive, he raised up, he humbled, all of that." This gets back, I mean, he's calling back to what happened when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly. He was brought down from his kingly throne. His glory was taken from him. And so he's going back over everything that we've already talked about. And I think sort of assuming Belshazzar already knew this, but he's setting up for him what is about to happen. Be like, hey, there's precedent for this. God has punished before when the king didn't repent. He'll do it again. And then verse 22, it says, "And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this." Basically, you have no excuse. You have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Can you fathom the, I don't know, the abject fear and horror that, I mean, should be going through Belshazzar's heart right now? I mean, this is frightening. There are two ways, I do like this. There are two ways to learn ramifications for actions. One is watching other people live through the ramifications of their actions. That is the best way of learning. That is like the least painful way. And it was fully an option for Belshazzar. He could have been like, I watched my grandfather, King Nebuchadnezzar, have to deal with the consequences of his actions. I will make sure I don't do that because it's very clear what the problem was. Or if you don't want to do that, you can have it happen to you. And that's where Belshazzar is right now. He knew what his grandfather had done. He knew what he was supposed to be doing, and he chose anyway not to. This is just, well, it's noteworthy. Still Daniel speaking, "O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty, and because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples and nations." I'm on the wrong spot, I'm sorry. Let me move forward. Oh, there it is. Sorry, 24. I don't know why I did that. "Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed." This is the writing that was inscribed. "Mene, mene, tekel, and parson." This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and to the Persians. I don't know about you, but I always, for whatever reason, just had in my mind that the writing on the wall didn't, like, they couldn't read it. But we actually have here what the words were. There are a lot of thoughts. Scholars have a lot of ideas on what these words actually literally meant. Most believe they referred to actual coins. So I think the popular interpretation is that it would have been read something like penny, penny, nickel, and dime. But you can understand why, you know, if you're the enchanters or magicians and there's like this disembodied hand basically writing on your wall and it writes penny, penny, nickel, and dime, you're like, well, it's cryptic for sure. I'm totally freaked out, but I don't know what that means. Like, what am I supposed to do with this? And so Daniel comes in and goes, I see what it says. I'm going to tell you what that means. And it means that God has already actually brought your kingdom to an end. Verse 28 indicates that this is already done. Whereas Nebuchadnezzar was given opportunity to repent, because Belshazzar knew enough, it's over. He has already way crossed the line, 100% over the line. He is done, and this is over. This is where we're going to end tonight, and in some ways it's kind of a rough way to end. I'm going to tell you what was happening outside the walls of Babylon at this very moment, how this prophecy was being answered in real time. But it's sort of a hard one, because on one hand, like I don't know, the part of me that is all like justice oriented and yeah, this is an awful guy, is like, yay, watch it go down. And there's this other part of me that's like, oh shoot, I think that's me. You know, I know what I'm supposed to be doing. I know what God's called me to do, and I don't do it, and I'm not walking in obedience, and I'm, making the same mistake over and over again. And I think we all sort of resonate with that, and probably resonate with both Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar here. And you're like, ah, shoot. So there is grace that God offers, and I mean, we're so blessed to be living post Messiah. We know Jesus Christ was the Messiah, and so that just gives huge comfort. But it makes it a little harder for me, at least, to be like, yay, watch Babylon go down. Because I mean, the way the Medes and Persians did this was brilliant, and I have huge respect for them for figuring this out. But I want to like couch it with that of, this is kind of a weird one. This is hard stuff. So the history, as Daniel's saying this, what's happening outside the walls. You remember earlier we talked about this just incredible fortification of the city. So the normal methods that the Medes and Persians would have used to get into a city, to take it down, they're not going to work here. And they're brilliant people. They've already taken Nabonidus. They're like, we can solve this. So the Euphrates River is feeding Babylon, this city, and it's filling up the moat. It's irrigating all these crops they have that are supplying it. And then on the other end, it's flowing out, because if it just feeds and feeds, it'll just overflow. So it's flowing out as well. So the Medes and Persians were like, let's take a play from the Beaver book. Let's dam this thing up. And that's exactly what they do. They actually clear trees, this huge area, and they actually divert the flow of the river so that it's not going into the city. And this is genius, because it's actually kind of subtle enough that probably you won't notice that this is going down until it's too late to be dealing with it. The other thing is, they're close enough to the city, presumably they understand that this king is having just his frat boy party and is completely unprepared to be a ruler, and it's just ridiculous. And so they're like, we're going to just divert this flow of water. And pretty quickly, this thing dries up. This allows them to do a couple of things. One, even if they can't manage to take the wall, they now have the ability to starve them out, because even though they've got farming, it requires a fair amount of irrigation. So once the water's gone, the farming comes to a pretty rapid end, and the city has to surrender. But even more so than that, I love this person. They say, did they dig an underground tunnel? They do even better. They just got to get through the valley of the moat and then just go straight through, because now it's dried out. They can just walk across. And I assume they probably actually didn't walk down and under. They probably just laid planks across and were like, let's just go. That makes it really, really easy to get into this city. And because Belshazzar was so incompetent as a leader, he was completely unprepared. So they're just sitting like, city is not prepared for an attack. They're not ready to go. And so the Medes and the Persians, they roll in and they take the city. And this fulfills the prophecy that God gave to King Nebuchadnezzar in the dream. This is that next empire that is going to take over, that's going to replace the Babylonian Empire, and it's done at this point. I think it's also interesting when this prophecy is written on the wall, Daniel's like, yeah, so that is a prophecy also, it's already done, like it's out. And at that point they had already dammed the thing up, and it was like probably hours, maybe days from the whole thing being shut down. And that is like the tragic and in some ways sort of like, again, I'm all conflicted. I don't know if you guys are having this. Maybe it's just a me issue. Even as I just sort of work it out verbally, I'm conflicted, because on one hand, I'm like, oh, we hate these guys. They've been so dumb and horrible to Daniel, and just exhausting, and we're just so frustrated with them. And at the same time, I'm like, yeah, but at the same time, we all sort of resonate with the behaviors and the paradigms and the mindset that got Belshazzar here, and the same thing that got Nebuchadnezzar to where he was. Now, I sort of imagine that Belshazzar does not, he doesn't have the same response that his father did. We don't see that here. Um, I'm going to bet that we will see King Nebuchadnezzar in heaven, which is like really weird. I think from everything that I can read that guy actually did pull it together. Belshazzar, we don't have that. And so on all of those fun notes and me just kind of like working that out in real time with you, I'll leave you tonight. We're a little bit over time. But this has been a great one. We dug into the archaeology, which we always love, and then also got to talk about a really clever invasion strategy from the Medes and Persians, which we always love. We want this to be a study where you are edified, where you are learning, and you're like, this is really interesting, and I love hearing about this. I love learning. It's new, and I'm always super excited to share that with you. I also want this to be something where more than just accomplishing some intellectual goal or scratching some intellectual itch, you actually come to know Jesus more. And the entire Old Testament is pointing to Jesus. And so the grace and redemption story is beautifully woven through all of this. And I would encourage you as you go and think about this week to be thinking about, where does grace and redemption fit into this? Where does the story of Jesus actually fit into what we talked about tonight? We have a Facebook page where we are always sharing information and communicating. It's just an amazing community Bible study hub. If you're on YouTube, you can hear that siren. If you're on YouTube, join Bible Study Hub on Facebook. We've got a link. And then also, if you ever miss these, or you just want to go back and refresh on something, YouTube is always available. With that, love you, team. Thanks for being with us. Have a wonderful night and go make great decisions this week. Good night.